The courtroom was filled with an unusual silence, the kind that doesn't just hang in the air but settles into the bones of everyone present. The walls, lined with polished wood that had seen countless trials before, seemed to absorb the weight of anticipation, making every shuffle, every cough, every whispered exchange echo like thunder. Rows of benches were packed with spectators, some who had come out of mere curiosity, others who had a personal stake in what was about to unfold. The buzz of conversation that had once lingered in the corridors before the trial began was gone now, replaced by a heavy stillness that made even the ticking of the old clock on the back wall feel like a disruption. All eyes were fixed forward, toward the front of the courtroom where the judge presided, his face stern, his gaze steady, and where the officers of the law stood in uniform, shoulders squared, their presence an undeniable reminder of authority and control. The defendant sat quietly, his hands folded, his expression unreadable, as if he understood the gravity of the moment better than anyone else in the room. His composure contrasted sharply with the tension that seemed to radiate from the people around him. There were those who looked at him with suspicion, eyes narrowed, waiting to hear the charges laid out in full detail. Others looked on with a kind of guarded empathy, not sure what to believe but unwilling to pass judgment too quickly. Whispers had already circulated about who he might be, what he might have done, but nothing was certain. The uncertainty was what made the silence so unbearable. Everyone was waiting for clarity, for the moment when speculation would give way to revelation. The air carried a weight, almost tangible, as if everyone inside the room understood they were not just witnesses to a trial, but to something far larger, something that might etch itself into memory long after the gavel fell. It was the kind of tension that makes people sit up straighter, hold their breath a little longer, and wonder if they will one day retell the story of how they were present when it all unfolded. Even the seasoned reporters, their notepads ready and pens poised, seemed more restrained than usual, choosing to observe carefully instead of scribbling furiously. They knew that whatever happened here would not be a routine report buried in the back pages, but something that could grip headlines and spark conversations across the city. The officers stationed around the room held their positions firmly, their eyes scanning the space with practiced discipline. Yet, beneath the uniform and the training, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the unusual energy filling the courtroom. They, too, felt the strain of the silence, though their duty demanded that they remain impassive. Every movement from the defendant was noted, every shift of his gaze watched carefully, not because he was disruptive, but because the room itself seemed to demand that nothing about him went unnoticed. It was as though the collective anticipation had turned him into a figure larger than life, someone whose very presence had the power to unsettle. The judge's gavel rested quietly on his desk, untouched, as if he too was allowing the silence to build, perhaps understanding that the moment was more than procedural. The lawyers shuffled their papers, cleared their throats, adjusted their suits, small gestures that betrayed the nerves beneath their professional masks. The jury members shifted in their seats, some leaning slightly forward, unable to disguise their curiosity. They had been instructed to listen, to weigh evidence, to remain impartial, but even they could not resist the pull of the atmosphere pressing down upon them. What made the scene even more gripping was the way the silence extended beyond the four walls. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, drawn by rumor and speculation. Some held signs, some stood quietly, and others argued among themselves about what they thought had happened and what they believed would come next. That energy seeped into the courtroom itself, carried in by the footsteps of those entering, by the hushed conversations that had preceded the trial, by the knowledge that the world beyond those walls was just as invested in the outcome as those inside. It was not the kind of silence born of peace or serenity, but of expectation, the kind that grips the chest and makes each second stretch into eternity. The courtroom became a stage, the people within it cast into roles they did not choose but could not escape. Spectators became witnesses, officers became symbols of order, and the defendant, quiet and composed, became the center of gravity pulling everyone inward. Every small sound, footsteps across the wooden floor, the creak of a bench, the rustle of a suit jacket, was amplified, cutting through the stillness like a blade. And in that tension, unspoken questions hung heavy. Who was this man really? What truths were about to surface? Why did it feel as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew? The officer walked into the courtroom with a presence that demanded attention, his uniform pressed to perfection, his badge gleaming beneath the overhead lights. His boots struck the floor with a steady rhythm that echoed against the wooden panels, each step deliberate, measured, and filled with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he had control over the situation. His face was stern, set in the familiar mask of authority that years of service had etched into his features. To him, this was another day, another case, another moment to stand as a representative of the law before the eyes of the public. He carried himself with the composure of someone who trusted that he knew the truth, that his position gave him the power to see right through the man sitting at the defendant's table. His eyes swept across the courtroom, scanning the crowd, the jury, the lawyers, and then finally settling on the defendant. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no flicker of doubt, only the unwavering belief that he already understood the man before him. To the officer, this was not someone to be pitied or misunderstood, this was someone whose identity had already been decided, someone who fit neatly into the categories he had spent his career enforcing. He adjusted his belt slightly, the gesture casual yet authoritative, as though to remind everyone, including himself, that he was in command of his role here. The confidence was not arrogance but something subtler, born of years of routine, of walking into rooms like this and knowing how the story usually went. He had testified countless times, stood before countless defendants, spoken with the same clipped tone, the same deliberate authority. He had long since mastered the art of appearing certain, of presenting himself as the figure who carried truth on his shoulders. His voice, when he cleared his throat, carried that same assurance, deep and steady, prepared to cut through the silence of the courtroom with the weight of authority. Spectators noticed his composure immediately. Some admired it, seeing in him the embodiment of discipline and order, the kind of man who kept society safe. Others studied him with a more critical eye, noting the rigidity of his posture, the way his confidence bordered on detachment, as though he were incapable of seeing the defendant as anything other than a case number. Regardless of interpretation, no one could deny the presence he brought into the room. He seemed to stand taller than the others, not because of physical height, but because of the certainty that radiated from him like an aura. The jury watched closely, taking in every detail. They were familiar with the pattern of courtroom dynamics, and they recognized the officer's demeanor as something practiced, something honed over years of testimony. His calmness, his confidence, his command of the room, it all fed into the perception that his word would carry weight. In their eyes, his certainty made him trustworthy, even before he spoke a single word. They leaned forward slightly, their anticipation growing, waiting for him to confirm what many of them already suspected about the man sitting silently at the defense table. The officer himself felt no hesitation. To him, this was a matter already decided, and his role was simply to deliver the truth he believed he carried. His chest rose with steady breaths, his hands resting at his sides, his gaze unwavering. He believed he understood the story, that the defendant fit into the framework of countless others he had encountered before. He believed the courtroom awaited his testimony not because of what he would reveal, but because of the authority with which he would deliver it. In his mind, his perspective was unshakable, his position unassailable. The stillness of the courtroom amplified his confidence. Every eye trained on him only reinforced his role as the figure of control, the one expected to speak with clarity and certainty. Even the defendant's quiet composure seemed to the officer like confirmation of what he already knew. Silence, after all, could be read as guilt, and to him, the lack of protest or outburst only deepened his certainty. He stood ready, prepared to speak, prepared to define the narrative before the room, certain that nothing could disrupt the version of events he had already formed. Outside of his own thoughts, however, the perception of his confidence carried ripples. Some in the audience felt reassured, their fears quieted by his steady presence, their doubts erased by the image of law embodied in his posture. Others, though, felt unease, recognizing that confidence without question could be dangerous, that certainty could blind as easily as it could lead. Yet, no one could deny that in this moment, the officer seemed unshakable, grounded in the belief that the man before him was exactly who he thought he was, and that nothing could change the truth as he understood it. The defendant's identity had been a mystery to many in the room, an unspoken question that lingered in every curious glance and hushed whisper. People wondered who he truly was, what his story might reveal, but no one expected the truth to carry the weight it did. From the outside, he appeared to be just another man caught in the system, another face in the endless line of defendants who passed through the courthouse doors every day. His quiet demeanor, the way he sat without protest, gave no indication that beneath the surface was a history far more complex than anyone dared to imagine. The lawyers spoke about him in detached tones, referring to him only by name, stripping away everything that made him human. To them, he was a case file, a subject to argue over, not a person with depth and significance. Yet his real identity was something none of them had prepared for. When the details began to surface, the first wave of shock rippled silently across the courtroom. The officer, who had stood so firmly in his confidence, found his composure tested in ways he had never experienced before. He had expected the man before him to be ordinary, to fit the pattern he had seen countless times in his career. But the revelation unraveled those assumptions piece by piece. This was not a stranger with no story, this was someone whose past and achievements commanded recognition. The man who sat quietly in the defendant's chair had once stood in places of honor, places that the officer himself respected deeply. The courtroom audience leaned in, their eyes widening as the truth became clear. Whispers erupted from the back rows, spreading like wildfire as people tried to reconcile what they were hearing with the image of the calm, silent man at the front. Some spectators clutched the edges of their seats, their disbelief written across their faces, while others shook their heads slowly, stunned by the gravity of the revelation. The jury members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances with one another, their earlier certainty shaken. What they thought had been a straightforward case was quickly transforming into something entirely different. The defendant's identity carried weight not only because of who he was, but because of what it meant for the assumptions that had been made about him. He was not a nameless figure, not a faceless part of the system. He was someone who had lived a life of significance, who had contributed in ways that demanded acknowledgement. The uniformed officer who had walked into the room so assuredly now found himself staring at the man with new eyes, forced to reconcile the story he had told himself with the reality that stood before him. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, seemed to falter ever so slightly, the first visible crack in his controlled exterior. The tension in the air thickened, each second stretching out longer than the last as the truth settled over the room. Some who had come expecting a spectacle now found themselves in awe, realizing they were witnessing a moment far larger than a simple trial. Others wrestled with discomfort, uneasy with how quickly perception had shifted. The defendant had been judged before the truth came out, and now the revelation demanded that everyone question their assumptions. His identity was not just a fact but a force, reshaping the very atmosphere of the courtroom. The officer's eyes lingered on him, no longer filled with the same unwavering certainty. Instead, there was hesitation, perhaps even regret, as he struggled to absorb what he had just learned. The man he had been so sure about was not who he thought he was, and the realization carried a weight that pressed down on him harder than any courtroom silence ever could. The courtroom, once dominated by the officer's presence, now revolved around the defendant, whose true identity pulled every gaze, every thought, every unspoken question into its orbit. The room had shifted, and nothing about it felt the same. ChatGPT said, the moment of realization did not arrive with loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but with a stillness so profound that it felt as though time itself had paused. The officer's expression, once set in firm lines of confidence and control, began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. His brow furrowed slightly, his lips parted as though searching for words that would not come, his eyes fixed on the defendant with a sharpness that betrayed the turmoil within him. It was not just a revelation of identity but a collapse of certainty, a dismantling of the narrative he had built in his mind before stepping into the courtroom. The murmurs from the crowd swelled, a tide of disbelief that filled the room. Spectators leaned toward one another, whispering in urgent tones, their voices barely contained by the decorum of the court. Some covered their mouths in astonishment, while others sat frozen, their eyes wide and unblinking as they tried to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The jury members, bound to silence by duty, could not hide their unease. Their eyes shifted nervously between the officer and the defendant, their earlier confidence dissolving into confusion. They had expected testimony to affirm what they already believed, but instead, they were confronted with a truth that unsettled the very foundation of their assumptions. The judge, usually a figure of stoic authority, shifted in his seat, his gavel resting untouched on the bench. Though his face remained composed, there was a heaviness in his posture, as though even he recognized the magnitude of the moment. He did not intervene, did not silence the murmurs, as if he understood that this was not an interruption to the proceedings but a vital part of them. The courtroom had become a stage where silence, gasps, and disbelief spoke louder than any testimony could. For the officer, the realization was more than professional, it was deeply personal. His training had taught him to identify suspects, to fit people into categories, to rely on patterns that rarely failed him. Yet here, in this moment, those patterns betrayed him. The man he had dismissed as ordinary was anything but. His identity carried weight, history, and honor, and the officer's assumptions unraveled under the weight of that truth. His shoulders, once squared with authority, seemed to sag under the invisible burden of realization. His jaw tightened, his chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, and his eyes betrayed something rare for a man so disciplined: doubt. The audience watched him closely, recognizing the shift even if they could not articulate it. This was not the image of authority they had expected to see. The officer, who had entered the room with such certainty, now stood exposed, his composure cracked by a truth he could not have anticipated. It was a moment of vulnerability that seemed almost unthinkable in the uniform he wore, and yet it was undeniable. The silence of the courtroom pressed in around him, amplifying his hesitation, magnifying his struggle. The defendant remained still, his calm demeanor unbroken, as though he had anticipated this moment all along. His quiet presence only heightened the contrast between himself and the officer, who now bore the weight of revelation on his face. The balance of power in the room had shifted, not through force or argument, but through truth revealed in its simplest form. The officer, once the embodiment of control, now found himself the one unsettled, while the man he had judged too quickly sat in silence, commanding the room without a single word. Every person present felt the weight of the realization. The air seemed charged, thick with tension, each breath shallow and deliberate as though no one dared to disturb the fragile silence that had settled over them. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of procedure but like a living, breathing entity, aware of the transformation taking place within its walls. People knew they were not merely witnessing a trial but a turning point, a moment when perception shattered and truth demanded acknowledgement. The officer's eyes flickered downward for a brief second, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, but in the charged atmosphere, it was as loud as any spoken confession. It was the look of a man grappling with the collapse of certainty, the look of someone forced to confront a truth that shook the foundations of his belief. The crowd watched, breathless, waiting for what would come next, but in that moment, it was not action that defined the scene. It was the silence, the gasps, the shared realization that nothing about this courtroom, this trial, or this man would ever be viewed the same way again. The silence that had gripped the courtroom began to fracture under the weight of human reaction. The moment the officer's expression betrayed his shock, the room itself seemed to exhale, and the audience could no longer contain themselves. Gasps filled the air, sharp and unrestrained, as though 1,000 unspoken thoughts had suddenly been given voice. People leaned forward in their seats, clutching at the wooden benches, their faces etched with disbelief. Some exchanged hurried whispers, speaking too quickly for their words to be understood, while others simply stared, mouths slightly open, unable to process what had just unfolded before their eyes. The jury, bound by formality yet unable to suppress their humanity, shifted visibly in their seats. One juror rubbed his temple, another crossed her arms tightly across her chest, while others exchanged fleeting glances, searching in each other's eyes for some kind of explanation or reassurance. They had been instructed to remain impartial, to listen without emotion, yet the revelation had cracked through that barrier. Their faces betrayed them, exposing the confusion and unease that swirled beneath their otherwise composed exteriors. Each juror carried the weight of responsibility, but now that responsibility felt heavier, clouded by a truth they had not anticipated. The judge observed the reactions quietly, his gavel still untouched. His presence, usually commanding enough to silence a restless crowd, was now secondary to the spectacle unfolding before him. His eyes flicked briefly toward the officer, then back to the defendant, as though even he needed time to process what had just been revealed. The lines on his face seemed deeper, etched with the strain of presiding over a moment that defied the usual order of the courtroom. He did not attempt to restore silence immediately, perhaps recognizing that this reaction was unavoidable, perhaps even necessary. In the gallery, emotion swelled like a rising tide. Some spectators shook their heads slowly, unable to reconcile the quiet man at the defense table with the identity that had just been revealed. Others pressed their hands to their chests, moved not only by the truth but by the sudden awareness of how quickly assumptions could be shattered. There were murmurs of admiration from some corners, disbelief from others, and a shared sense of awe that bound the crowd together, if only for a fleeting moment. The atmosphere felt electric, charged with the collective realization that they were not merely watching a trial, but a story that would echo far beyond these walls. The officer, standing at the center of it all, bore the brunt of those reactions. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, scrutinizing every flicker of expression, every shift of his stance. The confidence he had carried into the room seemed to dissolve beneath their gaze, replaced by an unease he could not mask. His jaw tightened, his posture wavered, and though he tried to steady himself, the effort was visible. To those watching, the once unshakable figure of authority now looked human in his vulnerability, stripped of the armor of certainty that had defined him. The defendant, however, remained composed, his silence a powerful contrast to the noise around him. He did not rise, did not speak, did not demand recognition. Instead, he sat with a quiet dignity, as though he had no need to defend himself against the reactions unfolding in the room. His calmness seemed to amplify the chaos around him, turning him into the still point at the center of a storm. It was this composure that drew the eyes of the audience, even more than the officer's unraveling. Without uttering a single word, he commanded the respect of those present, leaving them to grapple with the gravity of his identity on their own. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching across notepads as they tried to capture every gasp, every whispered exchange, every flicker of emotion that passed across the room. They knew instinctively that this moment would dominate headlines, not because of legal arguments or procedural motions, but because of the raw, unfiltered humanity it exposed. The courtroom, so often a place of rigid order, had become a theater of emotion, and they were determined to capture every detail. The tension did not dissipate but grew heavier, settling into the air like a thick fog. Every person in the room was aware of the significance of what they had just witnessed, and yet none of them knew what to do with that awareness. The weight of realization hung in the silence between gasps and whispers, stretching time into something unbearable. The very walls of the courtroom seemed to lean inward, as if listening, as if bearing witness to the moment when assumptions crumbled and truth demanded to be seen. The power of the moment did not rest in the revelation itself but in what lingered after, the echo of truth reverberating through every corner of the courtroom. The weight of the defendant's identity hung over the room like a heavy curtain, demanding that everyone present confront not only who he was but what that meant. The audience, once restless and quick to judge, now sat with an unspoken awareness that they had witnessed something greater than a trial. Their faces carried the strain of reflection, eyes darting between the officer, the defendant, and the bench, as if searching for guidance on how to process the magnitude of what they had learned. The officer's silence was its own lesson. The man who had entered with the certainty of authority, who had worn his confidence like armor, now stood exposed. His hesitation, his struggle to maintain composure, revealed more than any testimony could. It was a living reminder of how fragile assumptions can be, how quickly they can collapse in the face of truth. His posture, no longer perfectly erect, told a story of humility forced upon him by reality. Those who watched him could not help but see themselves reflected in his discomfort, recognizing their own tendency to judge too soon, too easily, without knowing the full story. The jury carried the burden most heavily. Their role demanded impartiality, but impartiality seemed impossible after such a revelation. Their pens, once scribbling dutiful notes, now rested motionless against their notepads. They looked inward, grappling with questions that had nothing to do with evidence or procedure. What does it mean to misjudge someone? How does one weigh truth when the very foundation of perception has shifted? Their silence spoke volumes, a silence laced with the awareness that this was no ordinary decision, no ordinary trial. The judge, though outwardly composed, seemed to embody the moral weight of the room. His eyes lingered on the defendant longer than they had before, as though acknowledging the depth of the man before him. He had presided over countless cases, each with its own complexities, but this one demanded something different. The gavel remained still because there were no disruptions to strike down. The disruption lay in the truth itself, and no gesture of authority could contain it. His stillness was not indifference but respect, a quiet recognition that what had been revealed carried lessons beyond the reach of law. The crowd in the gallery sat with a restless energy that no amount of order could suppress. Some bowed their heads, shaken by the sudden awareness of their own preconceived notions. Others stared intently at the defendant, their expressions softened by a recognition that had not been there before. The murmurs had faded into silence, replaced by a heavy contemplation that seemed to bind everyone together. Each person carried the weight differently, some with shame, some with awe, some with confusion, but all carried it nonetheless. The lesson was not spoken, yet it was etched into the air, undeniable and unshakable. The defendant's composure amplified that lesson in ways words never could. He did not gloat, did not meet the officer's faltering gaze with triumph, did not seize the moment to elevate himself. He simply sat in stillness, his presence steady, his dignity intact. That silence was not emptiness but strength, a strength that demanded recognition without force. His calmness spoke louder than any defense could, reminding the room that true power does not always come from authority or volume, but from the quiet assurance of knowing who you are despite how others perceive you. The reporters who had rushed to capture every detail began to realize that the story was no longer just about a shocking revelation. It was about perception, judgment, and the fragile nature of assumptions. Their pens moved more deliberately now, as though aware that what they were writing had to capture not only facts but meaning. The headlines they would draft later would carry the shock of the revelation, but between the lines, they would carry the weight of the lesson that unfolded in the room, the danger of presuming to know a man before truly seeing him. What lingered most was the silence after the gasps faded, the way the room seemed united in a collective reflection. Every person present had been forced to confront something uncomfortable within themselves, whether it was the tendency to rush to judgment, the trust placed in authority without question, or the ease with which appearances shape perception. The moment had stripped away illusions and left only truth, raw and undeniable. It was not the kind of truth that needed explanation or argument, it was the kind of truth that settled deeply into the heart, the kind that followed people long after they left the courtroom.